on overtime. It's called the One Big Beautiful Bill, and it will be the biggest bill ever passed in our country's history.
The Trump administration touting these tax cuts as a way to ease some of the pain caused by tariffs. How realistic is this plan going to be? Joining us now to discuss, Nathan Dean, Senior Policy Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Nathan, great to have you on here. So I want to talk about this July 4th deadline. That is the GOP's new target for the mega bill, according to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. To what extent does that mean that we will get clarity on tariff policy between now and July 4th, given the idea that the revenue from tariffs could potentially be a way to pay for all those tax cuts in that July 4th bill?
So I don't think you're going to see much in the way of clarity on the tariff argument because they're almost two separate issues. Obviously, President Trump loves to say that he's going to use tariffs to pay for this tax reform, but Congress isn't exactly thinking about that. Now, this is a $5.3 trillion bill. The bulk of it goes to extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But there's about $1.5 trillion in additional, like President Trump was saying, no taxes on tips, no taxes on Social Security. But the question that we have from the investment point of view is, yes, you have these tariffs going on, but what else do you have to cut to help pay for that? And that's primarily coming from Medicaid, SNAP benefits, and the Inflation Reduction Act. So even though President Trump can say that he's going to use tariffs to help pay for tax reform, we still don't know the true extent of what these quote-unquote deals or these memorandum of understandings that are occurring between the negotiators between the United States and these other countries. So Congress isn't exactly thinking about this tariff argument, but if this bill does come in sooner rather than later, I think you could see the White House potentially say, let's take a step back on tariff policy because the tax cuts are going to help generate economic growth.
Yeah, and I hear you separating out these different policies between tariffs and tax cuts, but then when we hear members of the administration talking about how tariffs are a revenue raiser as part of the way to pay for tax cuts, it's hard to not feel like they are lumped together. Talk to me about whether or not the need to use tariffs to raise revenue negates the idea that we may have tariff negotiations that make the tariffs less severe because the tariffs are a necessary revenue raiser.
Yeah, so, if you talk to the folks up on Capitol Hill, there's really no indication of how much they think is going to come in for tariffs. The economic lab up at Yale is estimating it's only collected around 2.4 billion, so that's billion with a B, and you're talking about a bill that's going to cost 5.3 trillion. But, the tariffs are not going into the reconciliation record, meaning tariffs are not being put in how you're going to pay for this bill. What the White House is saying is, look, we understand that you will have to pass this $5.3 trillion bill. Think of the tariffs coming from outside of this arrangement is helping to pay for that. And it certainly is going to give comfort to some of those Republicans that will ultimately vote for this, because one of our core scenarios is that when this passes, and we do think it can pass by the July timeframe, maybe not 4th of July, but definitely before the August recess, when this passes, we think that the deficit is going to increase substantially as a result of this, because we just don't see the pay-fors coming through the rest of the package actually getting the votes to pass the House or the Senate.
And Nathan, my co-host Jay Woods has a question for you.
Hey, Nathan. Thanks for joining us. We talk about that July 4th deadline. We've kicked deadlines down the road, so I think your recess is actually a good time frame for them to get this done. But how difficult is it going to be to pass? Because this was low-lying fruit, it seemed like, with the Republican administration to get that tax extension. Now it's muddied in the waters. So how much is this trade war going to hurt this tax bill going forward?
It's going to be extremely difficult. I mean, the margins in both the House and the Senate are extremely thin. And what the Republicans have essentially done so far is they've taken the easy road. They're just voting on resolutions. These are blueprints. But now they actually have to come out with the specific language. And that's what we're seeing in Congress this week with these markups. Now, what we're telling our clients is, look, Republicans are throwing the kitchen sink into this, so you're going to see a lot of different ideas, but eventually they have to be scaled back. But in terms of what you're going to see going forward is you are going to see continued negotiations of these tariffs. You will most likely see memorandums of understandings that will give the market some comfort. But the ultimate deadline of when Republicans have to pass this is the debt ceiling. And when Treasury comes out later this week or early next week with the new X date, which we think is probably late July, August, that's the deadline in which Congress has to get something done. Because if not, they're going to have to figure out another way to do the debt ceiling. And then that's just going to cause a lot of other problems because they're going to have to work with Democrats.
I also want to broaden the conversation a bit to talk about deregulation. This is something that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent again has said is a policy sweetener that the market is discounting. To what extent are you telling clients that same thing?
So deregulation is something that there's a lot of sentiment, especially going into the election. There was a lot of sentiment that deregulation was going to happen, but there's really no magic wand. You can just say poof and say go forth and deregulate, with the exception of the energy sector. So if you're an energy sector client, there are things that President Trump can do via executive order that can move things up and move the process much quicker. But when it comes to things like financials, when Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says they're going to do deregulation, there has to be a rulemaking process. Long story short is it takes about a year. Now, with all those agency leaders now coming into place and being confirmed by the Senate, we think these proposals are going to come out. So if you're looking at the big banks, for example, look for that proposals to come out later this year, and then ultimately reducing in capital, reducing leverage requirements to occur in 2026.
All right, Nathan, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for making the time this morning. We're going to have all your